Imagine a divided kingdom, where chariots of fire cut through the skies and prophets challenge kings. A time when a bloodthirsty queen orders the massacre of her own family, while a child hidden in the temple becomes the last hope of a millennia-old dynasty. This is the setting of 2 Kings, a book that narrates much more than history. It is an epic drama of power, betrayal, and faith. Within its pages, we find proud generals bowing before simple prophets, entire armies blinded by supernatural forces, and kings who melt down the temple's gold to pay tribute to conquering empires. It's a narrative intertwined with historical records from Assyria and Babylon, confirmed by archaeological discoveries such as the Moabite stone and the reliefs of the Palace of Nineveh. From the streets of Samaria to the banks of the Euphrates, this is the story of how two brotherly kingdoms marched toward their own downfall, ignoring prophetic warnings and abandoning their roots. It is a journey that begins with a king consulting a pagan god and ends with the greatest temple of the ancient world consumed by flames. Our story begins at a critical moment for the kingdom of Israel. As told in 2 Kings 1:1, Moab, a vassal kingdom that had long paid heavy tributes, rebelled against Israel shortly after the death of King Ahab. This was no small problem. Moab annually provided Israel with a massive tribute of 100,000 lambs and the wool of 100,000 rams. Losing this revenue dealt a significant blow to the economy of the northern kingdom. This rebellion occurred at a particularly vulnerable time. Ahab, despite his many spiritual failures, had been a competent military leader who kept neighboring nations under control. His son, Ahaziah, did not inherit his father's skills, and the surrounding kingdoms recognized his weakness. Moab's rebellion was only the beginning of the troubles to come. In the midst of this political crisis, a serious accident took place in the royal palace in Samaria. As described in 2 Kings 1:2, King Ahaziah fell from the balcony of his upper chamber. The text does not provide details on how the accident happened, but considering the architecture of the time, with terraces used for rest and observation, it was likely a significant fall. His injuries were severe enough to leave him bedridden, unable to perform his royal duties at such a delicate moment for the kingdom. Ahaziah's response to this accident reveals much about the spiritual state of the kingdom. Instead of seeking the God of Israel, who had demonstrated his power many times during his father's reign, including through the miracles of Elijah, he sent messengers to consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron. This decision was particularly significant. Ekron was one of the 5 major city-states of the Philistines, known for its oracle. Baal-zebub, whose name means Lord of the Flies, was considered a powerful deity, especially sought for matters of illness and healing. Consulting a foreign deity was more than just a personal choice. It was a direct affront to the God of Israel and a clear violation of Mosaic law. As the son of Ahab and Jezebel, Ahaziah continued his parents' syncretic religious policy, blending the worship of Yahweh with pagan cults. This practice had become so common that the king did not even try to conceal his consultation of a foreign god. But the God of Israel would not remain silent. In 2 Kings 1:3-4, the angel of the Lord appeared to Elijah with a direct and severe message. The prophet was to intercept the king's messengers and deliver a piercing question. Is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going to inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron? This rhetorical question exposed the absurdity of Israel's situation. Having the true God among them, they chose to seek help from foreign idols. The message continued with a definitive judgment. Therefore, this is what the Lord says: You will not leave the bed you are lying on. You will certainly die. This prophecy not only foretold Ahaziah's death, but also directly linked it to his spiritual unfaithfulness. His punishment was not merely for the accident, but for his sinful response to it. The messengers, shaken by their unexpected encounter with the prophet, quickly returned to the palace without completing their journey to Ekron. In 2 Kings 1-5-6, when Ahaziah questioned their premature return, they reported their encounter with a man who had intercepted them with this stern message. The biblical text shows that the messengers were so impacted by Elijah's authority that they did not even attempt to challenge his command to turn back. Curious about the identity of this bold prophet, Ahaziah asked about his appearance. In 2 Kings 1:7-8, the description was enough for immediate recognition. He was a man with a garment of hair and a leather belt around his waist. Upon hearing this, Ahaziah exclaimed, "It is Elijah the Tishbite." The prophet's description is significant. His rough clothing and leather belt identified him as someone who lived an austere life, fully devoted to God, in stark contrast to the luxurious lifestyle of the royal court. The king's reaction reveals his hardened heart. Instead of humbling himself before the divine message, he decided to arrest the messenger. In 2 Kings 1:9, he sent a captain with 50 men to fetch Elijah. They found the prophet sitting atop a hill, a position that, symbolically, placed him above the earthly authority that came to seize him. The captain, reflecting his king's arrogance, commanded, "Man of God," the king says, "come down." Notice the contrast. He acknowledges Elijah as a man of God, yet still tries to assert authority over him. Elijah's response was dramatic, demonstrating who truly held power in that moment. As recorded in 2 Kings 1:10, he answered, "If I am a man of God, may fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men." Immediately, fire fell from heaven and consumed the entire detachment. This display of divine power should have been enough to make the king reconsider his actions, but Ahaziah's hardened heart led him to send another group. The new captain in 2 Kings 1:11 was even more arrogant than the first, adding urgency to his command. "Man of God, this is what the king says. Come down at once." The result was the same. Fire from heaven consumed this group as well. It is striking how, even after 2 dramatic demonstrations of God's power, the king persisted in his rebellion. A third captain was sent with his 50 men. However, this officer was different. In 2 Kings 1:13-14, he approached Elijah with humility, kneeling and pleading, "Man of God, please let my life and the lives of these 50 servants of yours be precious in your sight." He acknowledged what the others had ignored, that true authority came from God, not the king. This attitude of humility saved their lives. The angel of the Lord, in 2 Kings 1:15, told Elijah to go down with him without fear. This is a powerful lesson about how humility before God can bring grace, while arrogance leads to destruction. Elijah then went to the king and personally delivered the message of death. As prophesied, Ahaziah died, and since he had no son, his brother Jehoram succeeded him on the throne. This event marked the beginning of the end for Ahab's house. But before this story continued, a crucial moment in Israel's prophetic history was about to take place. In 2 Kings 2, we find Elijah in his final moments on earth. The Lord had revealed that he would take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, and both the prophet and his disciple Elisha knew that the time was near. What follows is a significant journey, where Elijah tests Elisha's dedication 3 times, attempting to persuade him to stay behind. The journey began in Gilgal, a historic city where the Israelites had camped after crossing the Jordan with Joshua. From there, they went to Bethel, the place where Jacob had his vision of the ladder reaching heaven. Then they moved on to Jericho, the first city conquered in the Promised Land, and finally arrived at the Jordan River. In each of these cities, there was a community of prophets known as the Sons of the Prophets, who studied and preserved divine teachings. At each stop, the sons of the prophets approached Elisha with the same message as seen in 2 Kings 2:3. "Do you know that today the Lord will take your master from over you?" Elisha's constant response was, "Yes, I know, keep silent." This response demonstrates both his awareness of the situation and his determination to stay with his master until the very end. When they reached the Jordan, something extraordinary happened. As recorded in 2 Kings 2:8, Elijah took his cloak, rolled it up, and struck the waters. The waters parted, and the two crossed on dry ground. This miracle was not just a display of power, it was a reenactment of great moments in Israel's history. Moses parting the Red Sea and Joshua crossing the Jordan. It was as if God was affirming that Elijah stood in the same spiritual lineage as these great leaders. On the other side of the river, in an intimate moment between master and disciple, Elijah asked Elisha what he could do for him before being taken away. Elisha's response in 2 Kings 2:9 reveals his deep spiritual understanding. "Please let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." This request was not for twice Elijah's power, but a reference to the law of inheritance, where the firstborn received a double portion. Elisha was essentially asking to be recognized as Elijah's spiritual successor. Elijah's answer was clear. If Elisha saw him when he was taken, he would receive what he asked for. Then, as they walked and talked, something spectacular happened. In 2 Kings 2:11-12, a chariot of fire with horses of fire separated the two, and Elijah ascended to heaven in a whirlwind. Witnessing everything, Elisha cried out, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." This cry reveals how he saw Elijah as a spiritual father and as the true military strength of Israel, more powerful than its armies. After Elijah's departure, Elisha picked up the cloak that had fallen from his master, a visible symbol of the transfer of prophetic authority. Returning to the Jordan, he struck the waters with the cloak, crying out, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" The waters parted again, confirming that Elijah's spirit indeed rested upon him. This was not just a test of his authority, but a public demonstration that God had confirmed his succession. The sons of the prophets, watching from afar, immediately recognized the spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha. However, perhaps because they had not witnessed Elijah's ascension, they insisted on searching for him. In 2 Kings 2:16-17, they suggested that the Spirit of the Lord might have dropped him onto some mountain or valley. Despite Elisha's protests, they searched for 3 days without success. This fruitless search served to confirm definitively that Elijah had indeed been taken up to heaven. In Jericho, Elisha performed his first public miracle as Elijah's successor. The city faced a serious problem with its water, which was bad, and caused infertility in the land. In 2 Kings 2:19-22, Elisha asked for a new bowl with salt, went to the spring, and threw in the salt, declaring the water healed in the name of the Lord. The water was purified, establishing Elisha as a prophet, who, like his master, had the power both to judge and to bless. Shortly afterward, a disturbing incident occurred in Bethel. As Elisha was walking along the road, a group of youths came out from the city and began mocking him, saying, "Go up, bold man! Go up, bold man!" This was not a simple case of youthful teasing. Bethel was one of the main centers of the golden calf worship established by Jeroboam I, and this mockery represented a deliberate rejection not just of the prophet, but of his authority as a representative of the true God. As recorded in 2 Kings 2:23-24, Elisha turned around, looked at them, and cursed them in the name of the Lord. Then 2 bears came out of the forest and mauled 42 of those young men. This severe judgment firmly established Elisha's authority as the prophet of the Lord, demonstrating that disrespect toward God's prophet had serious consequences. The number of young men involved suggests that this was not an isolated incident, but rather an organized demonstration of contempt for prophetic authority. With the death of Ahaziah and the succession of his brother Jehoram to the throne of Israel, A new chapter was about to begin. The northern kingdom continued its downward spiral of apostasy, but God had not completely abandoned them. Through Elisha, he would continue to manifest his power and mercy, giving the people more opportunities for repentance before the final judgment. In 2 Kings 2:25, Elisha left the site of the bear incident and went to Mount Carmel, a significant place where his master Elijah had confronted the prophets of Baal years earlier. From there, he returned to Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, where he would begin his public ministry in a more intense way. This period marks an important transition in Israel's history. The kingdom now had a new king, Jehoram, brother of Ahaziah, and a new chief prophet, Elisha. As we see in 2 Kings 3:1, Jehoram began to reign in the 18th year of Jehoshaphat, a king of Judah. The text tells us that he did evil in the sight of the Lord, though not as much as his father Ahab and his mother Jezebel, for he removed the Baal pillar that his father had made. Removing the Baal pillar was a step in the right direction, but Jehoram did not completely abandon idolatry. He kept the golden calves that Jeroboam had established in Dan and Bethel, thus perpetuating the sin that had divided the kingdom after Solomon's death. This half-hearted reform would be a recurring pattern in Israel's history, superficial changes that never led to true spiritual transformation of the heart. Meanwhile, the rebellion of Moab, which had begun at the start of Ahaziah's reign, continued to be a serious problem. The new king would have to deal with this crisis, and the way he handled it would reveal much about the spiritual state of the kingdom. This would be the first major crisis that Elisha would face as Israel's chief prophet, setting the tone for his future ministry. The crisis with Moab required an immediate response from Israel's new king. In 2 Kings 3:4-5, we learn the extent of the problem. Manasseh, the king of Moab, was a sheep breeder who had paid the king of Israel an annual tribute of 100,000 lambs and the wool of 100,000 rams. After Ahab's death, he rebelled, causing a major economic impact on the kingdom. Jehoram could not ignore this defiance. As we read in 2 Kings 3:6-7, he left Samaria and mobilized all Israel for war. He also sent a message to Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, saying, "The king of Moab has rebelled against me. Will you go with me to fight against Moab?" Jehoshaphat, maintaining the alliance that his father had with Ahab's house, responded positively, "I will go. I am as you are, my people as your people, my horses as your horses." The two kings, along with the king of Edom, who was a vassal of Judah, decided to attack Moab by way of the wilderness of Edom. In 2 Kings 3:9, after 7 days of marching, the army found itself in a desperate situation. There was no water for the troops or the animals with them. The situation was so dire that Jehoram exclaimed in 2 Kings 3:10, "Alas, the Lord has called these 3 kings to deliver them into the hands of Moab." It was Jehoshaphat who demonstrated spiritual wisdom at that moment. In 2 Kings 3:11 he asked, "Is there no prophet of the Lord here, through whom we may inquire of the Lord?" One of the servants of the king of Israel informed them that Elisha, who had served Elijah, was present. Jehoshaphat affirmed, "The word of the Lord is with him." The 3 kings went to Elisha, but the prophet initially responded harshly to Jehoram. In 2 Kings 3:13-14, he said to the king of Israel, "What have I to do with you? Go to the prophets of your father and the prophets of your mother." Only out of respect for Jehoshaphat did Elisha agree to inquire of the Lord. He asked for a musician, and as the music played, the hand of the Lord came upon him. The prophecy that followed was extraordinary. In 2 Kings 3:16-19, Elisha announced that the valley would be filled with ditches, and without wind or rain, it would be filled with water. Moreover, he promised complete victory over Moab. The next morning, at the time of the morning sacrifice, water flowed from the direction of Edom, and the land was filled with water. When the Moabites rose early and saw the water reflecting the morning sun, it appeared red like blood. They assumed that the three kings had fought among themselves and slaughtered one another. Confident, they went to the Israelite camp to plunder, but they were met with an army ready for battle. The defeat was devastating. The king of Moab, seeing that he was losing the battle, made one last desperate attempt with 700 men to break through to the king of Edom, but he failed. In an extreme act of desperation, recorded in 2 Kings 3:27, he took his firstborn son, who was to succeed him as king, and offered him as a burnt sacrifice on the city wall. This horrific act provoked great indignation against Israel, and the armies withdrew, returning to their own lands. After this demonstration of Elisha's prophetic power, his fame began to spread, and many people started seeking him for help. In 2 Kings 4, we find a series of miracles that demonstrate God's care for individuals in need. The first case is particularly touching. A widow of one of the sons of the prophets cried out to Elisha in 2 Kings 4:1-7. Her husband had died, leaving debts, and the creditor was coming to take her 2 sons as slaves. Elisha asked what she had in her house, and she replied that she had only a jar of oil. The prophet instructed her to borrow empty vessels from all. Her neighbors, go inside with her sons, shut the door, and fill all the vessels with the oil from the jar. Miraculously, the oil only stopped flowing when there were no more vessels to fill. Elisha then instructed the widow to sell the oil, pay her debts, and live off the remainder with her children. This miracle not only saved a family from slavery, but also demonstrated how God cares for the practical needs of his people. Next, we meet a wealthy woman from Shunem who frequently hosted Elisha whenever he passed through the town. In 2 Kings 4:8-10, she and her husband even built a room on the rooftop specifically for the prophet, furnishing it with a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp. This act of hospitality would be rewarded in an extraordinary way. Elisha wanted to repay her kindness and discovered that she had no children and that her husband was elderly. In 2 Kings 4:15-16, he prophesied that by the following year she would embrace a son. The promise was fulfilled, but a few years later, the child suddenly died after complaining of a headache while in the field with his father during the harvest. The Shunammite woman displayed extraordinary faith. In 2 Kings 4:22-24, she requested a donkey and a servant to take her quickly to Mount Carmel, where Elisha was. When her husband questioned the trip, since it was neither a new moon nor a Sabbath, usual days to visit prophets, she simply replied, "All is well." Her determination and faith would be rewarded. As the woman approached, Elisha sent his servant Gehazi to meet her and ask if everything was all right. She affirmed this to the servant, but when she reached Elisha, she clung to his feet in distress. In 2 Kings 4:27-28, she expressed her anguish. "Did I ask my Lord for a son? Did I not say, 'Do not deceive me'?" Elisha sent Gehazi ahead with his staff to place it on the boy's face, but the woman insisted that she would not leave without the prophet himself. In 2 Kings 4:32-35, Elisha arrived at the house and found the child lying dead on his bed. He shut the door, prayed to the Lord, and lay upon the child, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, hands to hands. The boy's body began to warm up. Elisha got up, walked around the house, and then lay on the boy again, who sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. This resurrection miracle further established Elisha's authority and showed that the power that had rested upon Elijah was now fully upon his successor. The news of this wonder surely spread throughout Israel, leading more people to seek the prophet's help. Later, during a time of famine, Elisha was with the sons of the prophets in Gilgal. In 2 Kings 4:38-41, someone unknowingly gathered a poisonous wild plant and added it to the stew. When they began to eat, they cried out, "There is death in the pot, O man of God." Elisha asked for flour, threw it into the pot, and the food became safe to eat. Another miracle of provision occurred when a man from Baal Shalisha brought first fruits of bread to the prophet. In 2 Kings 4:42-44, with only 20 barley loaves and some fresh grain, Elisha fed 100 men, and there was even food left over, fulfilling the word of the Lord. One of the most significant miracles of Elisha's ministry involved Naaman, the commander of the Syrian army. In 2 Kings 5:1-2, he is described as a great man, highly regarded, and a valiant warrior, but he was a leper. A young Israelite girl who served his wife spoke about the prophet in Samaria who could heal him. With letters from the king of Syria, Naaman came to Israel seeking healing. In 2 Kings 5:9-12, he arrived with his horses and chariots at Elisha's door, but the prophet merely sent a messenger instructing him to wash 7 times in the Jordan River. Naaman was outraged, expecting a more ceremonial treatment, and questioned why he could not bathe in the rivers of Damascus instead. It was his own servants who convinced him to try, reasoning that if the prophet had asked him to do something difficult, he would have done it. In 2 Kings 5:14-15, Naaman dipped 7 times in the Jordan as the man of God had instructed, and his skin became as clean as that of a child. He returned to Elisha, confessing that there was no God in all the earth except in Israel. When Naaman offered gifts, Elisha refused to accept anything. However, Gehazi, Elisha's servant, was overcome with greed. In 2 Kings 5:20-27, he ran after Naaman and, lying in his master's name, requested a talent of silver and 2 sets of clothing. As a consequence of his greed and dishonesty, Naaman's leprosy clung to Gehazi and his descendants forever. Elisha's ministry continued to grow. In 2 Kings 6:1-7, the sons of the prophets needed to expand their dwelling place. During the construction, one of them dropped a borrowed axe head into the river. Elisha threw a piece of wood into the water, and the iron floated, allowing the man to retrieve it. Elisha's fame even reached Syria, which was at war with Israel. In 2 Kings 6:8-12, the prophet revealed the Syrian army's battle plans to the king of Israel, frustrating their ambushes. When the king of Syria discovered that it was Elisha who was revealing his secrets, he sent a great army to capture him in Dothan. The next morning, Elisha's servant was terrified upon seeing the city surrounded. But the prophet prayed in 2 Kings 6:16-17, "O Lord, open his eyes so that he may see." The servant then saw the mountain full of horses and chariots of fire surrounding Elisha. When the Syrians advanced to seize him, Elisha prayed, and they were struck with blindness. The prophet then led them to Samaria, where their eyes were opened. Instead of killing them, the king of Israel, under Elisha's guidance, offered them a great feast and sent them back. As a result, the Syrian troops stopped invading the land of Israel. However, sometime later, Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, besieged Samaria, causing a terrible famine in the city. In 2 Kings 6:24-29, the situation became so desperate that a donkey's head was sold for 80 shekels of silver, and women even resorted to cooking their own children. The king of Israel, in his anguish, blamed Elisha and swore to take his life. In 2 Kings 7, Elisha prophesied that by the next day there would be an abundance of food in Samaria. A royal officer doubted this, and the prophet declared that he would see it, but would not eat of it. During the night, the Lord caused the Syrian army to hear a great noise of chariots and horses, making them flee in panic, abandoning their entire camp. 4 lepers, who were at the entrance of the city gate, discovered the abandoned camp. After satisfying their hunger, they announced the good news to the city. The people rushed out and plundered the Syrian camp, fulfilling Elisha's prophecy. The officer who had doubted was trampled at the city gate and died, seeing the abundance but not partaking in it, just as the prophet had foretold. In 2 Kings 8, Elisha advised the Shunammite woman to leave the country for 7 years due to an impending famine. When she returned, she found her land occupied and went to the king to plead for it. Providentially, at that very moment, Gehazi was telling the king about how Elisha had resurrected her son. The king was so impressed that he ordered the restoration of all her property, along with all the produce of the fields from the day she had left the land. Elisha's ministry was about to enter a new phase. In Damascus, Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, was ill and sent his official Hazel to consult the prophet regarding his recovery. In 2 Kings 8:7-10, Hazael came to Elisha with a massive gift, 40 camels loaded with all the best goods of Damascus. The prophet told Hazael that Ben-Hadad would recover from the illness, but also revealed that despite this, he would certainly die in another way. In 2 Kings 8:11-12, something extraordinary happened during this encounter. Elisha fixed his gaze on Hazael until he became ashamed, and then the prophet began to weep. When Hazael asked the reason for his tears, Elisha replied that he was crying because he knew the evil that Hazael would bring upon the children of Israel. You will set fire to their fortresses, kill their young men with the sword, crush their little ones, and rip open their pregnant women. Feigning humility, Hazael responded, "But what is your servant, a mere dog, that he should do such a great thing?" Elisha then revealed, "The Lord has shown me that you will be king of Syria." This prophecy would soon be fulfilled, for in 2 Kings 8:14-15, when Hazael returned to Damascus, he suffocated Ben-Hadad with a wet cloth and took his place as king of Syria. These events marked a new phase in the history of Israel and Judah. Elisha's ministry would continue, but now within a context of growing political and military tension. A new power was rising in Syria, and dramatic changes were about to take place in both Hebrew kingdoms. The time of judgment against the house of Ahab had finally come. In 2 Kings 9:1, Elisha called one of the sons of the prophets and gave him a specific mission. He was to go to Ramoth-Gilead with a flask of oil to anoint Jehu as the new king of Israel. The city of Ramoth-Gilead was a strategic point where the army of Israel was camped, defending the border against the Syrians. Elisha's instructions were precise. In 2 Kings 9:2-3, the young prophet was to look for Jehu, son of Jehoshaphat, son of Nimshi. Take him into an inner room, away from his companions. Pour the oil on his head and declare, "Thus says the Lord, I have anointed you king over Israel." After that, he was to open the door and flee without delay. The young prophet found Jehu sitting with the other army captains. In 2 Kings 9:5-6, he said, "I have a word for you, O captain." When Jehu asked for whom, the young man answered, "For you, O captain." Leading Jehu into the house, he poured the oil on his head and delivered the full message from the Lord. The divine message was clear and terrifying. In 2 Kings 9:7-10, God declared that Jehu was to strike down the house of Ahab, avenging the blood of the prophets and the servants of the Lord that had been shed by Jezebel. The entire house of Ahab would perish, cut off down to the last male, both free and slave. The house of Ahab would be like the house of Jeroboam and the house of Baasha, other dynasties that had been completely destroyed because of their sins. As for Jezebel, dogs would devour her in the field of Jezreel, and no one would bury her. After delivering this devastating message, the young prophet opened the door and fled, as Elisha had instructed. When Jehu returned to his fellow officers, they noticed that something extraordinary had happened. In 2 Kings 9:11-13, they asked, "Is everything well? Why did this madman come to you?" Jehu's response was direct. He revealed that he had been anointed king over Israel. The officer's reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. Each of them took off his cloak and placed it under Jehu's feet. On the steps, forming a kind of makeshift throne, they blew the trumpet and proclaimed, "Jehu is king." This quick acceptance suggests widespread dissatisfaction with the house of Ahab among the military leaders. Jehu acted swiftly. In 2 Kings 9:14-16, he conspired against Joram, who was in Jezreel recovering from wounds received in battle against the Syrians. Ahaziah, king of Judah, was also there visiting the wounded king. To maintain the element of surprise, Jehu ordered that no one leave the city to warn Jezreel. Jehu's approach was dramatic. In 2 Kings 9:17-20, the watchman in Jezreel saw a company approaching and alerted the king. Joram sent a rider to ask if they came in peace. Jehu replied, "What do you have to do with peace? Fall in behind me." The watchman reported that the messenger did not return. A second messenger was sent, but he too did not return. The watchman then recognized Jehu's driving style, noting that he drove furiously. Joram, king of Israel, and Ahaziah, king of Judah, each set out in their chariots to meet Jehu. In 2 Kings 9:21-22, they encountered him in the field of Naboth the Jezreelite, a place of deep symbolic significance, for it was there that Ahab and Jezebel had committed a terrible crime years before. When Joram asked, "Is it peace, Jehu?" the response was devastating. "What peace, as long as the harlotries of your mother Jezebel and her sorceries are so many?" What followed was swift and deadly. In 2 Kings 9:23-26, Joram tried to flee, crying out, "Treachery, Ahaziah!" But Jehu drew his bow with full strength and struck Joram between the shoulders. The arrow pierced his heart, and he collapsed dead in his chariot. Jehu ordered his body to be thrown into Naboth's field, fulfilling the prophecy that the Lord had spoken against Ahab's house. Ahaziah also attempted to escape, but was wounded by Jehu at the ascent of Gur. He managed to reach Megiddo, where he died. In 2 Kings 9:27-28, his servants carried him in a chariot to Jerusalem, where he was buried with his ancestors in the city of David. The next target was Jezebel. In 2 Kings 9:30-37, when she learned that Jehu was coming to Jezreel, she painted her eyes, adorned her head, and looked out from the window. As Jehu entered the gate, she taunted him, saying, "Is it peace, Zimri, murderer of his master?" Jehu looked up and asked, "Who is on my side?" 2 or 3 eunuchs showed themselves, and he commanded, "Throw her down." They threw her down, and her blood splattered against the wall and the horses, which trampled her underfoot. After eating and drinking, Jehu ordered that she be buried, for she was a king's daughter. However, when they went to retrieve her body, they found only her skull, feet, and the palms of her hands. Everything had happened exactly as the Lord had spoken through Elijah. Dogs would devour Jezebel's flesh in the field of Jezreel. The purge against Ahab's house continued. In 2 Kings 10:1-7, Jehu sent letters to the elders of Samaria, where 70 sons of Ahab lived. He challenged them to select the best and most fit of their master's sons, place him on the throne, and fight for their master's house. Fearing for their lives, the elders replied that they were Jehu's servants and would do whatever he commanded. Jehu then sent a second letter, demanding the heads of Ahab's 70 sons. The elders killed them all and sent their heads in baskets to Jezreel. In 2 Kings 10:12-14, Jehu encountered 42 men from Ahaziah's family who were traveling to visit the royal family in Samaria. He ordered them to be captured alive and then executed them at the well of Beth-Eked. No member of the royal house was spared. The next phase of the revolution focused on eliminating Baal worship. In 2 Kings 10:18-28, Jehu used deception, proclaiming, "Ahab served Baal a little, Jehu will serve him much." He summoned all the prophets, servants, and priests of Baal for a great assembly, claiming he would offer a grand sacrifice to Baal. Ensuring that only Baal worshippers were present, he provided them with special garments and filled the temple of Baal. As the sacrifice was being offered, Jehu ordered his guards and captains, "Go in and strike them down, let no one escape." 80 men were stationed with the warning that if anyone allowed an escapee, he would pay with his own life. After the slaughter, they destroyed Baal's pillar, tore down the temple, and turned it into a latrine, a fate that remained for a long time. Despite this apparent religious zeal, Jehu was not a complete reformer. In 2 Kings 10:29-31, the text states that he did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, who had led Israel into sin, as he continued to uphold the golden calves. In Bethel and Dan, the Lord commended Jehu for executing what was right in his eyes concerning Ahab's house, promising that his descendants would sit on Israel's throne to the 4th generation. However, Jehu did not commit himself to walking in the Lord's law with all his heart. Jehu's kingdom faced external difficulties. In 2 Kings 10:32-33, the Lord began to reduce Israel's territory. Hazael, king of Aram, conquered all the Israelite lands east of the Jordan, from Aroer to Gilead and Bashan, territories belonging to the tribes of Gad, Reuben, and Manasseh. After reigning over Israel for 28 years, Jehu died and was buried in Samaria, succeeded by his son Jehoahaz. With his death, a bloody yet significant chapter in Israel's history came to an end. Ahab's house had been completely wiped out, fulfilling every word the Lord had spoken. Official Baal worship had been severely struck down, though not entirely eradicated. However, Jehu's reforms were incomplete, and his kingdom saw the beginning of a territorial decline that would continue in the following generations. While the northern kingdom underwent a bloody revolution under Jehu, an equally severe crisis was unfolding in Judah. In 2 Kings 11:1, when Athaliah, Ahaziah's mother, saw that her son was dead, she rose and destroyed all the royal offspring. Athaliah was the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, and had married Jehoram of Judah as part of an alliance between the two kingdoms. Now, following in her mother Jezebel's cruel footsteps, she sought to secure her own power through murder. However, amid the chaos and violence, an act of courage would change the course of history. In 2 Kings 11:2-3, Jehosheba, the sister of King Ahaziah and wife of the priest Jehoiada, secretly took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, from among the king's sons who were being killed. She hid him along with his nurse in a bedroom, keeping him out of Athaliah's sight. For 6 years, the boy remained hidden in the house of the Lord, while Athaliah reigned over the land. This 6-year period was a dark time for Judah. Athaliah, having eliminated, or so she thought, all legitimate heirs to the throne, ruled with an iron fist. As the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, she actively promoted the worship of Baal in Jerusalem. In 2 Chronicles 24:7, we are told that she and her sons had broken into the house of God and used all the consecrated objects from the temple of the Lord for the Baals. During this time, the priest Jehoiada carefully planned the restoration of the legitimate Davidic lineage. In 2 Kings 11:4-8, in the 7th year, he secretly gathered the centurions of the royal guard and the couriers and brought them to the house of the Lord. He made a covenant with them, having them swear an oath, and then showed them the king's son. Jehoiada's plan was meticulous and involved the regular rotation of the temple guard on the Sabbath. He divided the guards into 3 groups. 1/3 would guard the royal palace, another third would station at the gate of Sur, and the last third would stand at the gate behind the couriers. 2 additional groups, who would normally go off duty on the Sabbath, were to remain in the house of the Lord to protect the king. Jehoiada's instructions were precise. The guards were to surround the young king, each with his weapon in hand, and anyone who attempted to break through the ranks was to be killed. They were to remain with the king at all times, emphasizing the real danger of the situation and the need for constant protection. In 2 Kings 11:9-12, on the appointed day, the centurions did everything as the priest Jehoiada had commanded. Each took his men, both those coming on duty and those going off duty on the Sabbath, and they came to the priest. Jehoiada handed the centurions the spears and shields that had belonged to King David and were kept in the house of the Lord, properly arming the guards. The moment of coronation was dramatic. The guards took their positions, each with his weapon in hand, from the right side to the left side of the temple, near the altar and the sanctuary, surrounding the king. Then Jehoiada brought out the king's son, placed the crown on him, and handed him the testimony, likely a copy of the law. They anointed Joash and proclaimed him king, clapping their hands and shouting, "Long live the king!" And Athaliah, hearing the noise of the people running, came to them at the house of the Lord. In 2 Kings 11:13-14, when she looked, she saw the king standing by the pillar, as was the custom, with the captains and trumpeters by his side, and all the people of the land rejoicing and blowing trumpets. Athaliah tore her robes and cried out, "Treason! Treason!" The priest Jehoiada acted swiftly to prevent the temple from being defiled with bloodshed. In 2 Kings 11:15-16, he ordered the centurions to take Athaliah outside the ranks and to kill anyone who followed her. She was taken along the route of the horse entrance to the royal palace, where she was executed. After Athaliah's execution, Jehoiada established a series of important reforms. In 2 Kings 11:17-18, he made a covenant between the Lord, the king, and the people, declaring that they would be the people of the Lord. He also made a covenant between the king and the people, restoring the constitutional order of the kingdom. The people responded enthusiastically to the reforms. They went to the temple of Baal and tore it down completely, smashing its altars and idols. They killed Mattan, the priest of Baal, in front of the altars. The priest Jehoiada then appointed guards over the house of the Lord to ensure its protection. The restoration of legitimate rule was completed with a solemn ceremony. In 2 Kings 11:19-20, Jehoiada took the centurions, the royal guard, the couriers, and all the people of the land, and they led the king from the house of the Lord to the royal palace through the gate of the guards. Joash sat on the throne of the kings, and all the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was at peace after Athaliah's death. Joash was only 7 years old when he began to reign, as stated in 2 Kings 12:1. Under the guidance of the priest Jehoiada, he grew up with a strong religious influence. In 2 Kings 12:2-3, the text tells us that he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord all the days that the priest Jehoiada instructed him. However, the high places were not removed. The people still sacrificed and burned incense there. One of the main accomplishments of Joash's reign was the restoration of the temple. In 2 Kings 12:4-6, he ordered the priests that all the money brought to the house of the Lord as offerings should be used to repair the breaches in the temple. However, by the 23rd year of his reign, the priests had still not repaired the breaches. Faced with this delay, Joash took practical measures. In 2 Kings 12:7-12, he summoned the priest Jehoiada and the other priests and questioned them about the lack of progress in the repairs. A new system was established. A chest with a hole in its lid was placed next to the altar, and all the money brought to the house of the Lord was deposited there. When there was a large amount of money in the chest, the king's scribe and the high priest counted and bagged the money, handing it directly to the supervisors of the work. The money was used to pay the carpenters, builders, masons, and stonecutters, as well as to purchase wood and cut stone for the repair of the temple. In 2 Kings 12:13, it is interesting to note that the money was not used to make silver utensils for the temple. All of it was directed toward the structural restoration work. However, The reign of Joash faced external challenges. In 2 Kings 12:17-18, Hazael, king of Syria, marched to fight against Gath and captured it. When he turned to attack Jerusalem, Joash took all the sacred things that his ancestors had dedicated, all the gold found in the treasuries of the house of the Lord and the royal palace, and sent everything to Hazael. With this payment, he managed to make the Syrians withdraw from Jerusalem. The end of Joash's reign was tragic. In 2 Kings 12:20-21, his servants conspired against him and killed him at the house of Millo, which goes down to Silla. Josiah, son of Shemith, and Jehozabad, son of Shomer, his servants, struck him down and he died. He was buried with his ancestors in the city of David, and his son Amaziah reigned in his place. In the Chronicles, we find additional information about Joash's spiritual decline after the death of Jehoiada. The text tells us that he abandoned the house of the Lord and began serving Asherah poles and idols. When Zechariah, son of Jehoiada, rebuked him for this, Joash ordered him to be stoned to death in the courtyard of the temple, a shocking act of ingratitude considering that Jehoiada's family had saved his life and placed him on the throne. Joash's violent death came as divine judgment for these actions. It serves as a solemn reminder of how even a reign that begins well can end in tragedy when a king strays from the ways of the Lord. The period of Athaliah and Joash demonstrates both the danger of corrupt influences and the power of faithfulness to God. It also highlights how external reforms, as important as they are, must be accompanied by true heart transformation. Throughout this period, the northern kingdom under the dynasty of Jehu continued its own journey of spiritual and territorial decline. The two sister nations were about to enter a new phase of their history where their interactions would become increasingly complex and often hostile. The reign of Amaziah in Judah and the dynastic changes in Israel would bring new challenges and conflicts to both kingdoms. In 2 Kings 13:1, in the 23rd year of Joash, son of Ahaziah, king of Judah, Jehoahaz, son of Jehu, began to reign over Israel in Samaria. His reign lasted 17 years and marked a period of great affliction for the northern kingdom. Like his predecessors, Jehoahaz did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, following the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who had led Israel into sin with the golden calves. The consequence of this spiritual unfaithfulness was severe. In 2 Kings 13:3-7, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he delivered them into the hands of Hazael, king of Syria, and into the hands of Ben-Hadad, son of Hazael, for all those days. The oppression was so intense that Israel's army was reduced to only 50 horsemen, 10 chariots, and 10,000 infantrymen. The text tells us that the king of Syria had destroyed the rest, making them like dust on the threshing floor. In his desperation, Jehoahaz sought the Lord's favor. In 2 Kings 13:4, he prayed, and the Lord heard him because he saw Israel's oppression and how the king of Syria was oppressing them. God sent a deliverer, though the text does not specify who this deliverer was. It could have been Jehoahaz's son Joash, or possibly Jeroboam II, under whose reign Israel would recover much of its territory. Despite this divine mercy, the people did not completely abandon their sins. In 2 Kings 13:6, they continued walking in the sins of the house of Jeroboam, and the Asherah pole remained standing in Samaria. This persistence in idolatry would continue to bring consequences to the kingdom. After the death of Jehoahaz, his son Joash ascended to the throne of Israel. In 2 Kings 13:10-11, he began to reign in the 37th year of Joash, king of Judah, and ruled for 16 years in Samaria. Like his father, he did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam. During his reign, a significant event took place involving the prophet Elisha. In 2 Kings 13:14-19, Elisha was suffering from the illness from which he would die, and Joash, king of Israel, went down to him and wept over him, saying, my father, the chariots of Israel and their horsemen." This was the same expression Elisha had used when Elijah was taken up, recognizing that spiritual power was more important than military strength. Even on his deathbed, Elisha had one last prophetic message for the king. He told Joash to take a bow and arrows, placed his hands on the king's hands, and instructed him to open the window facing east and shoot an arrow, declaring, "This is the arrow of the Lord's victory, the arrow of victory over Syria. For you shall strike the Syrians in Aphek until you have destroyed them." Then Elisha ordered the king to take the arrows and strike the ground. Joash struck 3 times and stopped. The prophet was angered and told him that he should have struck 5 or 6 times. Then he would have completely destroyed Syria. Now, however, he would defeat Syria only 3 times. Even after his death, God performed a miracle through Elisha. In 2 Kings 13:20-21, when a man was being buried, those carrying the body saw a Moabite raiding party, and in haste they threw the body into Elisha's tomb. As soon as the dead man touched Elisha's bones, he revived and stood on his feet. This posthumous miracle confirmed the power of God that had worked through his prophet. Throughout Jehoahaz's reign, Hazael, king of Syria, had oppressed Israel. However, in 2 Kings 13:22-25, after Hazael's death, Joash recovered from the hands of Ben-Hadad, son of Hazael, the cities that Hazael had taken from his father Jehoahaz. 3 times Joash defeated him and regained Israel's cities, fulfilling exactly Elisha's prophecy regarding the 3 victories. The conflict between the brotherly kingdoms also intensified during this period. In 2 Kings 14:8-10, Amaziah, king of Judah, challenged Joash, king of Israel, to a face-to-face battle. Joash responded with a sarcastic parable. The thistle in Lebanon sent a message to the cedar in Lebanon, "Give your daughter to my son in marriage." But a wild animal in Lebanon came along and trampled the thistle. It was a warning for Amaziah not to become overconfident. Amaziah ignored the warning, and the result was disastrous for Judah. In 2 Kings 14:11-14, the 2 armies clashed at Beth Shemesh, and Judah was defeated by Israel. Joash captured Amaziah, marched to Jerusalem, and tore down 400 cubits of the city wall from the Ephraim gate to the corner gate. He seized all the gold, silver, and vessels found in the house of the Lord and the treasuries of the royal palace, along with hostages, and returned to Samaria. After Joash's death, his son Jeroboam II took the throne of Israel. According to 2 Kings 14:23-25, he reigned for 41 years in Samaria. Though he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, not turning away from the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, his reign marked a period of great prosperity and territorial expansion for Israel. Jeroboam II restored Israel's boundaries from the entrance of Hamath to the Sea of the Arabah, in accordance with the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, spoken through his servant Jonah, son of Amittai, the prophet from Gath-hepher. This was a period of remarkable territorial and economic recovery for Israel. In 2 Kings 14:26-27, the text provides a divine perspective on this prosperity. The Lord saw that Israel's suffering was bitter. There was neither slave nor free, nor was there anyone to help Israel. And since the Lord had not said he would blot out Israel's name from under heaven, he saved them by the hand of Jeroboam, son of Joash. However, this material prosperity masked a deep spiritual and moral decline. The prophets Amos and Hosea, who ministered during this period, provide a vivid picture of Israelite society. In Amos 4:1-2, the prophet denounces the wealthy women of Samaria who oppressed the poor and needy. In Hosea 4:1-2, we find a list of sins that included perjury, lying, murder, theft, and adultery. The prosperity of Jeroboam II's reign came at a high social cost. In Amos 5:11-12, the prophet condemns those who trample the poor and accept bribes. In Amos 6:4-6, he describes the luxurious lives of the rich, who lay on ivory beds, feasted on the best lambs and calves, but felt no grief over Israel's ruin. Hosea, in turn, uses his own marriage as a metaphor for the relationship between God and Israel. In Hosea 1:9, he is commanded to marry a promiscuous woman, symbolizing how Israel had prostituted itself, turning away from the Lord. The names of his children, Jezreel, Lo-ruhamah, not loved, and Lo-ami, not my people, were prophetic messages about Israel's impending judgment. In Hosea 4:6, we find one of the most serious accusations. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Despite all its material wealth, Israel had lost true knowledge of God. In Hosea 7:8-9, the prophet compares Ephraim, Israel, to a half-baked cake, burnt on one side and raw on the other, and says that foreigners were consuming its strength without it even realizing. The message of the prophets was clear. Judgment was coming. In Amos 8:11-12, he prophesies a time when there would be a famine in the land, not for bread or water, but for hearing the words of the Lord. In Hosea 9:3, the prophet announces that the people would not remain in the Lord's land. Instead, Ephraim would return to Egypt and eat defiled food in Assyria. After Jeroboam II's death, the northern kingdom entered a period of rapid decline and political instability. In 2 Kings 15:8, his son Zechariah reigned for only 6 months before being publicly assassinated by Shallum, son of Jabesh. With his death, the promise the Lord had made to Jehu that his descendants would sit on Israel's throne for 4 generations was fulfilled. Zechariah's assassination marked the beginning of a chaotic period in which Israel's throne changed hands rapidly through violence and betrayal. The prosperity of Jeroboam II's reign would soon give way to a time of political instability and decline, culminating in the fall of Samaria and the end of the northern kingdom. The shadow of the Assyrian Empire was growing ever larger over the land. The prophecies of Amos would become increasingly relevant during this period. In Amos 7:7-9, the prophet had a vision of the Lord holding a plumb line, indicating that God was measuring Israel and would no longer tolerate its deviations. The sanctuary of Bethel would be destroyed, and the house of Jeroboam would be struck down by the sword. In 2 Kings 15:13-14, Shallum, son of Jabesh, who had assassinated Zechariah, reigned for only 1 month in Samaria. Menahem, son of Gadi, came up from Tirzah, entered Samaria, struck down Shallum and killed him, taking the throne in his place. The violence that had marked the beginning of Jehu's dynasty had now become a recurring pattern in Israel's royal succession. Menahem's reign was marked by the growing influence of Assyria. In 2 Kings 15:19-20, when Pul, also known as Tiglath-Pileser III, king of Assyria, invaded the land, Menahem gave him 1,000 talents of silver to secure his support and confirm his rule. To raise this money, he imposed a tax of 50 shekels of silver on every wealthy man in Israel. This was the first time Israel paid tribute to Assyria, setting a precedent that would eventually lead to its destruction. In 2 Kings 15:22, after the death of Menahem, his son Pekahiah took the throne, but he reigned for only 2 years before being assassinated. In 2 Kings 15:25-26, Pekah, the son of Remaliah and one of his captains, conspired against him and struck him down in Samaria, in the citadel of the king's palace, along with Argob and Arieh. Pekah had 50 men from Gilead with him in the conspiracy. He killed Pekahiah and reigned in his place. Pekah's reign would mark a critical turning point in Israel's history. In 2 Kings 15:29-30, during his days, Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria, came and captured Ijon, Abel, Beth-Makkah, Janoah, Kadesh, Hazel, Gilead, Galilee, and all the land of Naphtali, deporting the people to Assyria. This was the beginning of the deportation process that would culminate in the fall of Samaria years later. Political instability persisted when Hoshea, son of Elah, conspired against Pekah, son of Remaliah, struck him down, killed him, and took the throne. Hoshea would be the last king of Israel, and his reign would witness the end of the northern kingdom. The shadow of Assyria, which had once been a distant threat during the prosperous days of Jeroboam II, now became a devastating reality that would forever change the fate of the 10 northern tribes. Hoshea's reign would mark the final chapter in the history of the northern kingdom. In 2 Kings 17:1-2, he began to reign in Samaria over Israel in the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, and ruled for 9 years. The text states that he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, though not like the kings of Israel who came before him. This observation suggests that Hoshea may have implemented some minor reforms, but they were not enough to prevent the impending judgment. Israel's political situation had become extremely precarious. In 2 Kings 17:3, Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, marched against Hoshea, who became his vassal and paid tribute. The northern kingdom had effectively become a puppet state of the Assyrian Empire, losing its political and economic independence. However, Hoshea made a fatal mistake that would hasten the kingdom's final destruction. In 2 Kings 17:4, the king of Assyria discovered a conspiracy. Hoshea had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and stopped paying the annual tribute to Assyria. This attempt to play the two great powers against each other, a common diplomatic strategy at the time, ended up backfiring against Israel. The Assyrian response was swift and devastating. As 2 Kings 17:4-6 recounts, the king of Assyria arrested Hoshea and imprisoned him. Then he invaded all of Israel, besieged Samaria, and held it under siege for 3 years. This prolonged siege demonstrates both the strength of Samaria's fortifications and the Assyrians' determination to conquer it. In the 9th year of Hoshea, Samaria finally fell. In 2 Kings 17:6, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and deported the Israelites to Assyria, settling them in Hala, on the Harbor River in Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. This mass deportation was a standard Assyrian policy designed to break national resistance and prevent future rebellions. The biblical text then pauses the historical narrative to offer a theological explanation for this catastrophe. In 2 Kings 17:7-8, it explains that this happened because the Israelites had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They feared other gods and followed the customs of the nations that the Lord had driven out before them. The list of sins is extensive and specific. In 2 Kings 17:9-12, the Israelites secretly did things that were not right against the Lord their God. They built high places in all their towns, from watchtower to fortified city. They set up sacred pillars and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every leafy tree. They burned incense on all the high places, like the nations the Lord had removed before them, and they did evil things that provoked the Lord to anger. In 2 Kings 17:13-15, the text emphasizes that the Lord had warned Israel and Judah through all his prophets and seers, saying, "Turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and statutes." However, they did not listen and instead stiffened their necks, just as their ancestors had done, refusing to believe in the Lord their God. They rejected his statutes and his covenant, and followed worthless idols, becoming worthless themselves. Religious syncretism is particularly highlighted. In 2 Kings 17:16-17, they abandoned all the commandments of the Lord their God, made 2 golden calves and an Asherah pole, worshipped all the starry host, and served Baal. They sacrificed their sons and daughters in fire, practiced divination and sorcery, and sold themselves to do evil in the Lord's sight. The consequence of this unfaithfulness was divine wrath. In 2 Kings 17:18, the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them. From his presence, only the tribe of Judah remained. This separation between the northern tribes and Judah had begun with the division of the kingdom after Solomon, but now it became permanent through exile. The text then makes an important observation about Judah. In 2 Kings 17:19, even Judah did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God. Instead, they followed the customs that Israel had introduced. This statement serves as a foreshadowing of the future judgment that would also come upon the southern kingdom. The narrative then returns to the story of the kingdom's original division. In 2 Kings 17:21-23, when the Lord tore Israel away from the house of David, they made Jeroboam, son of Nebat, their king. Jeroboam led Israel away from the Lord, causing them to commit a great sin. The Israelites continued in all the sins of Jeroboam and did not turn away from them until the Lord removed Israel from his presence, just as he had warned through all his prophets. The Assyrian policy of deportation is then detailed. In 2 Kings, chapter 17, verses 24-26, the king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and settled them in the cities of Samaria in place of the children of Israel. This transplanted population took possession of Samaria and lived in its cities. At the beginning of their settlement there, they did not fear the Lord. Therefore the Lord sent lions among them, which killed some of them. This problem was reported to the king of Assyria with an interesting religious interpretation. In 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 26 and 27, it was said to him, "The nations you have deported and settled in the cities of Samaria do not know the customs of the God of the land. Therefore he has sent lions among them, and behold, they are killing them because they do not know the customs of the God of the land." The king of Assyria then ordered that one of the deported priests be sent back to teach them the customs of the God of the land. The result was the development of a unique syncretic religion. In 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 29-33, each nation continued making its own gods and placing them in the houses of the high places that the Samaritans had built. The Babylonians made Succoth-Benoth, the people of Cutha made Nergal, those from Hamath made Ashima, the Avites made Nibaz and Tartak, and those from Sepharvaim burned their children in fire as offerings to Adramelech and Anamelech. They feared the Lord, but they also served their own gods. This religious syncretism continued for generations. In 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 34-41, even up to the time of the text's writing, they continued following their old customs. They did not truly fear the Lord, nor did they follow his statutes, ordinances, laws, or the commandment that the Lord had given to the children of Jacob, whom he had named Israel. The theological conclusion is clear. Exile came as a direct result of disobedience to the covenant. Prophetic warnings had been ignored, idolatry had become endemic, and pagan practices had corrupted worship. The deportation of the Israelites and their replacement by foreign peoples marked the effective end of the 10 northern tribes as a distinct political and religious entity. The events that led to the fall of Samaria and its consequences served as a solemn warning for Judah. As noted in 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 19, the southern kingdom was following a dangerously similar path. The history of the northern kingdom would become a cautionary lesson for future generations, demonstrating the consequences of unfaithfulness to the covenant with God. The region that had once been the northern kingdom would now become known as Samaria and its inhabitants. A mixture of remaining Israelites and foreign settlers would become the Samaritans. This mixed population would develop its own version of Judaism, accepting only the Torah as sacred scripture and establishing its center of worship on Mount Gerizim instead of Jerusalem. The fall of Samaria represented not only the end of a political entity, but also a profound rupture in the history of the covenant people. The 10 northern tribes were effectively lost to history, though traditions about their fate continued to circulate. The focus of biblical history would now shift entirely to Judah, where the Davidic dynasty continued and where significant reforms were about to take place under the reign of Hezekiah. Amid these dramatic changes in the north, the kingdom of Judah faced its own challenges. In 2 Kings chapter 18 verse 1, in the 3rd year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. His reign would mark a period of profound religious reforms and unprecedented political challenges. In 2 Kings chapter 18 verses 2 and 3, Hezekiah was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Abi, daughter of Zechariah. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, following everything that David, his father, had done. This comparison to David is significant, as it marks Hezekiah as one of Judah's most faithful kings. Hezekiah's reforms were comprehensive and radical. In 2 Kings chapter 18 verses 4 and 5, he removed the high places, broke the pillars, cut down the Asherah pole, and smashed the bronze serpent that Moses had made, because until that time the children of Israel had been burning incense to it and calling it Nehushtan. The text emphasizes that he trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel, so that after him there was no one like him among all the kings of Judah, nor among those who came before him. The destruction of the bronze serpent is particularly significant. This object, originally made by Moses in the wilderness to heal the Israelites, had become an idol. Hezekiah's willingness to destroy even an artifact with sacred history demonstrates his determination to eliminate any form of idolatry. In 2 Kings chapter 18, verses 6 and 7, we see that Hezekiah clung to the Lord, did not depart from him, and kept the commandments that the Lord had given to Moses. The Lord was with him. In everything he undertook, he prospered. He rebelled against the king of Assyria and did not serve him, demonstrating extraordinary trust in God in the face of the greatest military power of the time. His confidence was not unfounded. In 2 Kings chapter 18 verse 8, he struck down the Philistines as far as Gaza and its territories, from the watchtower to the fortified city. These military victories showed that divine blessing was upon him, just as it had been with David. However, the greatest challenge of Hezekiah's reign was yet to come. In 2 Kings chapter 18 verses 9 to 12, the text pauses to recall the fall of Samaria, which occurred in the 4th year of Hezekiah, the 7th year of Hoshea. This reminder serves to contrast Hezekiah's faithfulness with the unfaithfulness that led to the northern kingdom's destruction. The first major test came in the 14th year of King Hezekiah. In 2 Kings 18:13-16, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, marched against all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. Initially, Hezekiah attempted to appease the king of Assyria by sending a message of submission and offering to pay whatever tribute was imposed. The tribute was heavy, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. To pay it, Hezekiah had to use all the silver found in the house of the Lord and in the treasuries of the king's palace, even stripping the gold from the doors and doorposts of the temple. But this payment did not satisfy Sennacherib. In Kings 18:17-18, he sent the Tartan, the Rabsaris, and the Rabshakeh with a large army from Lachish to Jerusalem to King Hezekiah. These officials stopped at the aqueduct of the Upper Pool on the road to the Washer's Field and called for the king. What followed was an extraordinary psychological battle. In 2 Kings 18:19-25, the Rabshakeh, the Assyrian spokesman, delivered a speech calculated to shake the confidence of the Jews. He questioned Hezekiah's reliance on Egypt, calling it a broken reed, mocked his trust in the Lord, misinterpreting Hezekiah's religious reforms as an attack on true worship, by referencing the altars he had removed, and even claimed that the Lord himself had sent him to destroy the land. Hezekiah's officials, Eliakim son of Hilkiah, the palace administrator, Shebna the scribe, and Joah son of Asaph the recorder, asked the Rabshakeh to speak in Aramaic so that the people on the wall would not understand. In 2 Kings 18:26-27, the Rabshakeh's response was even more provocative, insisting on speaking in Hebrew and threatening the people with the horrors of a siege. The Rabshakeh's speech to the inhabitants of Jerusalem, recorded in 2 Kings 18:28-35, was a masterpiece of psychological propaganda. He warned the people not to be deceived by Hezekiah, promised deportation to a land of abundance, a beneficial exile, and directly challenged the power of the Lord, comparing him to the gods of the nations that Assyria had already conquered. The people's response, following Hezekiah's instructions, was total silence. In 2 Kings 18:36, they did not answer a word, for the king had commanded, "Do not answer him." The officials returned to Hezekiah with their clothes torn and reported the Rabshakeh's words. Hezekiah's reaction demonstrated his piety. In 2 Kings 19:1-4, upon hearing the blasphemous words, he tore his clothes, covered himself with sackcloth, and went to the house of the Lord. He sent his officials, also dressed in sackcloth, to the prophet Isaiah, acknowledging that this was a day of distress, rebuke, and blasphemy, and asking him to pray for the remaining remnant. Isaiah's response was encouraging. In 2 Kings 19:5-7, he assured them that the Lord had heard the blasphemous words and promised that Sennacherib would hear a rumor, return to his land, and there be slain by the sword. This prophecy would be fulfilled in detail. The Rabshakeh found Sennacherib fighting against Libnah, as he had already withdrawn from Lachish. In 2 Kings 19:9-13, upon hearing that Tirhakah, king of Ethiopia, was coming to fight against him, Sennacherib sent new messengers to Hezekiah with a threatening letter, listing all the nations he had destroyed and challenging the God of Israel to save Jerusalem. Hezekiah's response to this letter reveals his deep faith. In 2 Kings 19:14-19, he went up to the house of the Lord and spread the letter before him. His prayer acknowledged the Lord as the one true God, the creator of heaven and earth, and pleaded for deliverance, not just for Judah's safety, but so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone, O Lord, are God. The divine response came through Isaiah in an extensive and poetic prophecy. In 2 Kings 19:20-34, the Lord answered Sennacherib's challenge, mocking his arrogance and reminding him that all his military successes were merely the fulfillment of God's plan. The prophecy promised that Sennacherib would not enter Jerusalem, would not shoot an arrow there, would not raise a shield against it, nor build siege ramps around it. The fulfillment of this prophecy was dramatic and supernatural. In 2 Kings 19:35-36, that very night, the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in their camp. When the survivors awoke the next morning, they found the dead bodies all around them. Sennacherib withdrew and returned to Nineveh. Sennacherib's end, recorded in 2 Kings 19:37, also fulfilled the prophecy. While worshipping in the house of his god Nisroch, his own sons, Adramelech and Sharezer, struck him down with the sword and fled to the land of Ararat. His son Esarhaddon succeeded him as king. After this miraculous deliverance, Hezekiah faced a personal crisis. In 2 Kings 20:1-3, he became mortally ill. The prophet Isaiah came to him with a solemn message, "Set your house in order, for you will die and not live." Hezekiah turned his face to the wall and prayed to the Lord, recalling how he had walked faithfully before him with a wholehearted devotion, doing what was good in his sight. and he wept bitterly. The divine response was immediate. In 2 Kings 24:6, before Isaiah had even left the middle courtyard, the word of the Lord came to him, instructing him to return and tell Hezekiah that his prayer had been heard. God promised to add 15 years to his life and to deliver both him and the city from the hand of the king of Assyria. As a sign of this promise, in 2 Kings 28-11, the Lord made the shadow on the steps of Ahaz's sundial go back 10 degrees. This extraordinary miracle would be remembered even by foreign nations, as we will see next. During his recovery, Hezekiah received a significant visit. In 2 Kings 20:12-13, Merodach-Baladan, king of Babylon, sent letters and a gift to Hezekiah. Because he had heard that he had been sick, Hezekiah was pleased with the messengers and showed them his entire treasure house, the silver, the gold, the spices, the fine oils, his armory, and everything in his storehouses. This display of wealth would prove to be a costly mistake. In 2 Kings 20:14-18, the prophet Isaiah came to Hezekiah and prophesied that days would come when everything in his house would be taken to Babylon, and some of his descendants would serve as eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Hezekiah's response in 2 Kings 20:19 reflects a mix of resignation and gratitude for the peace in his own days. Hezekiah's reign concludes with a summary of his accomplishments in 2 Kings 20:20-21. Among his notable works was the pool and the tunnel that brought water into the city, an impressive feat of engineering known today as Hezekiah's Tunnel, which can still be visited in Jerusalem. After his death, his son Manasseh reigned in his place, ushering in an era that would undo much of the good Hezekiah had accomplished. Manasseh's ascent to the throne of Judah marked the beginning of the end for the southern kingdom. In 2 Kings 21:1-2, he was only 12 years old when he began to reign, and he ruled for 55 years in Jerusalem, the longest reign of any king of Judah or Israel. His mother's name was Hephzibah. The text is straightforward in its assessment. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, following the abominations of the nations that the Lord had driven out before the children of Israel. Manasseh's long reign was a period of profound spiritual and cultural transformation in Judah. In 2 Kings 21:3-5, he not only reversed all his father Hezekiah's reforms, but also took idolatry to new extremes. He rebuilt the high places that Hezekiah had destroyed, erected altars to Baal, and made an Asherah pole, just as Ahab had done in Israel. His devotion to astral worship was so intense that he built altars for all the host of heaven in both courtyards of the Lord's temple. The desecration of the temple reached unprecedented levels. In 2 Kings 21:6-7, Manasseh made his own son pass through the fire, a practice associated with the worship of Molech that involved child sacrifice. He practiced divination, consulted omens and mediums, and multiplied provocations against the Lord. The height of his offense was placing a carved image of the Asherah pole inside the very temple, the place God had chosen to put his name forever. The book of 2 Chronicles provides additional details about this period. In 2 Chronicles 33:6-9, he not only practiced these abominations, but also led Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem astray, causing them to do more evil than the nations the Lord had destroyed before them. When the Lord spoke to Manasseh and his people, they did not listen. The prophetic response to these actions was severe. In 2 Kings 21:10-15, through his servants the prophets, the Lord announced that he would bring such disaster upon Jerusalem and Judah that it would make the ears of those who heard it tingle. The metaphor used is particularly significant. God would apply to Jerusalem the same measuring line and plumb line used to judge Samaria before its destruction. Like a dish that is wiped and turned upside down, so God would wipe Jerusalem clean. Persecution of the faithful reached terrible levels during his reign. In 2 Kings 21:16, Manasseh shed so much innocent blood that he filled Jerusalem from one end to the other. Jewish tradition, preserved in the Talmud, states that among his victims was the prophet Isaiah, who was said to have been sawn in half, a possible reference to Hebrews 11:37, which mentions prophets who were sawn apart. However, 2 Chronicles presents a surprising aspect of Manasseh's story. In 2 Chronicles 33:11-13, the Lord brought against him the commanders of the Assyrian army, who captured him with hooks, bound him with bronze chains, and took him to Babylon. In his distress, he humbled himself greatly before the God of his ancestors and prayed. God heard his supplication and restored him to Jerusalem. After his return, Manasseh attempted to reverse some of the damage. In 2 Chronicles 33:14-17, he rebuilt the outer wall of the city of David, removed the foreign gods and the idol from the Lord's house, as well as all the altars he had built. On the mount of the Lord's temple, he restored the altar of the Lord and offered peace and thanksgiving sacrifices on it. However, the people still sacrificed on the high places, though only to the Lord their God. This late conversion of Manasseh, though genuine, was not enough to change the course of history. The spiritual and moral damage inflicted during his long reign was too deep. In Jeremiah 15:4, the Lord declares that because of Manasseh, son of Hezekiah, king of Judah, and all he had done in Jerusalem, the people would be handed over to exile. After Manasseh's death, his son Amon took the throne. In 2 Kings 21:19-22, he was 22 years old when he began to reign and ruled for only 2 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Meshullemeth, daughter of Haruz from Jotbah. Amon completely followed the early example of his father, serving and worshipping the idols Manasseh had worshipped, abandoning the Lord and not walking in his ways. Amon's reign was marked by violence and ended in tragedy. In 2 Kings 21:23-24, his own servants conspired against him and assassinated him in his house. However, the people of the land executed all the conspirators and placed his son Josiah on the throne. This popular action suggests that, despite the apostasy of the leaders, there was still a strong sense of loyalty to the Davidic line among the people. Josiah represented the last great hope for reform in Judah. In 2 Kings 22:1-2, he was only 8 years old when he began to reign, and he ruled for 31 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jedidah, daughter of Adiah from Bozkath. The text presents him as an exemplary king who walked in all the ways of David, not turning aside to the right or to the left. In the 18th year of his reign, a transformative event took place. In 2 Kings 22:3-7, while overseeing restoration work in the temple, the high priest Hilkiah found the book of the law. This discovery suggests the extent of neglect into which temple worship had fallen. The very law of God had been lost or forgotten during the previous reigns. Josiah's reaction upon hearing the words of the law was dramatic. In 2 Kings 22:11-13, he tore his robes in deep sorrow and immediately sent a delegation to consult the Lord on what should be done. The group sought out the prophetess Huldah, who lived in the 2nd district of Jerusalem. Huldah's response was both a warning and a personal promise to Josiah. In 2 Kings 22:15-20, she confirmed that all the judgment written in the book would come upon Judah due to its persistent unfaithfulness. However, because Josiah's heart was tender and he humbled himself before the Lord, he would be gathered in peace and would not witness all the disaster that God was bringing upon that place. Josiah's reforms were the most comprehensive since the days of David. In 2 Kings 23:4-14, he began with a thorough cleansing of the temple, removing all the articles made for Baal, Asherah, and all the host of heaven. The idolatrous priests were deposed, the houses of the cult prostitutes were destroyed, and the high places were defiled. The reform extended beyond Jerusalem. In 2 Kings 23:15-20, Josiah destroyed the altar at Bethel that Jeroboam had built, fulfilling a prophecy spoken 300 years earlier. He removed all the shrines of the high places in the cities of Samaria, demonstrating an effort to restore pure worship even in the former lands of the northern kingdom. The climax of the reforms was the celebration of Passover. In 2 Kings 23:21-23, Josiah commanded that the feast be observed as written in the Book of the Covenant. The text emphasizes that such a Passover had not been celebrated since the days of the judges. Not even the celebrations in the times of David or Solomon could compare in terms of faithfulness to the requirements of the law. Josiah's spiritual evaluation is extraordinary. In 2 Kings 23:25, no king before him had turned to the Lord with all his heart, soul, and strength according to all the law of Moses, nor did any arise like him afterward. However, even this remarkable king could not reverse the course of divine judgment. In 2 Kings 23:26, the Lord did not turn away from the fierceness of his great wrath against Judah because of the provocations of Manasseh. Josiah's end was both tragic and premature. In 2 Kings 23:29-30, he was killed by Pharaoh Necho at Megiddo as Necho was on his way to aid the king of Assyria. His death marked the beginning of Judah's rapid final decline. Less than 25 years after his death, Jerusalem would be destroyed. The succession of kings after Josiah illustrates the kingdom's accelerated deterioration. First came Jehoahaz, who reigned only 3 months before being taken captive to Egypt. In 2 Kings 23:31-33, he was 23 years old when he began to reign and did what was evil in the Lord's sight. Pharaoh Necho imprisoned him at Riblah and imposed a heavy tribute on Judah. Pharaoh Necho then appointed another of Josiah's sons as king, changing his name from Eliakim to Jehoiakim. In 2 Kings 23:34-37, Jehoiakim reigned for 11 years and was an oppressive ruler who heavily taxed the people to pay tribute to Egypt. He built his palace using unpaid forced labor, as condemned by the prophet Jeremiah. The international scene changed dramatically during Jehoiakim's reign. In 2 Kings 24:1-2, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, invaded the land, and Jehoiakim became his vassal for 3 years before rebelling. As a result, the Lord sent raiding bands of Chaldeans, Syrians, Moabites, and Ammonites to destroy Judah. After Jehoiakim's death, his son Jehoiakim reigned for only 3 months before Nebuchadnezzar took him captive to Babylon. In 2 Kings 24:12-16, this first deportation was extensive. In addition to the royal family, all the treasures of the temple and palace were taken, along with all the princes, all the mighty men, 10,000 captives, and all the craftsmen and smiths. Only the poorest people of the land were left behind. Nebuchadnezzar then appointed Mattaniah, Jehoiakim's uncle, as king, changing his name to Zedekiah. In 2 Kings 24:18-19, Zedekiah was 21 years old when he began to reign, and he ruled for 11 years in Jerusalem. Like his immediate predecessors, he did what was evil in the Lord's sight. The end came when Zedekiah rebelled against Babylon. In 2 Kings 25:1-7, Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem with his entire army. After a 2-year siege, the famine in the city was so severe that there was no bread for the people. When the Babylonians broke through the walls, Zedekiah tried to flee at night, but was captured. His sons were executed before his eyes, after which he was blinded and taken in chains to Babylon. The destruction of Jerusalem was methodical and complete. In 2 Kings 25:8-21, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, burned the temple, the royal palace, and all the important houses of Jerusalem. The walls were torn down, and most of the remaining population was taken into exile. Only a few of the poorest people were left behind to be vineyard keepers and farmers. The final verses of the book offer a small glimpse of hope. In 2 Kings, chapter 25, verses 27 to 30, after 37 years of captivity, evil Merodach, king of Babylon, released Jehoiakim from prison and granted him a position of honor above the other exiled kings, providing him with a daily allowance for the rest of his life. This small act of mercy suggested that even in exile, the Davidic line had not been completely cut off, and that God still had a future for his people beyond. Judgment. Thus ends the book of 2 Kings, a powerful narrative that takes us from the division of the kingdom to the Babylonian exile. It is a story that teaches us about the consequences of our choices, the importance of faithfulness, and how God remains faithful even when his people fail. We have seen faithful and wicked kings, courageous prophets, extraordinary miracles, and ultimately, the tragic consequences of persistent disobedience. If you enjoyed this journey through the history of 2 Kings and want to continue learning more about the scriptures, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to receive updates on upcoming videos. Also, share this content with friends and family who might benefit from it. See you in the next video, where we will continue exploring the wonderful stories of the Bible.